In the opening scene, Sarah, a mysterious girl, is chatting on her phone with her friend Neil. She tells him someone is on their way and suggests meeting at an abandoned mall. Suddenly, she hears the sound of breaking glass nearby. Unaware of the danger, she goes closer to investigate, only to be attacked by a creature hidden under a blanket. In the following scene, two best friends, Paul and Mac, are racing their bikes towards the same abandoned mall where Sarah had been earlier. Mac suggests searching for props related to horror stories. Suddenly, Paul discovers a dead bird. Mac playfully teases him about it, causing Paul to flee on his bike. Further ahead, Paul stumbles on an escalator, and as he picks himself up, he hears Neil calling out for Sarah, holding a gun. Meanwhile, Sarah, who is not completely dead, falls from the skylight behind Neil. Neil approaches Sarah cautiously, urging Paul to leave. Despite Neil's warning, Paul tries to follow Neil and Sarah. Neil carries Sarah away, attempting to escape the mall, while Paul picks up a bullet from the ground. As Neil tries to flee, a girl's figure tries to distract him, and the creature suddenly appears behind him, attacking him. Paul witnesses in horror as the creature licks Neil's eyes. After witnessing the frightening scene, Paul swiftly rushes back, while Mac calls out to him. Despite hearing a gunshot, Mac initially dismisses it as unreal. However, seeing Paul visibly terrified, he begins to suspect it might indeed be real. Paul quickly urges Mac to go home with him without saying anything. Moreover, Sarah's husband Mark brings a woman home for intimacy. The woman accidentally enters Sarah's room, where Mark informs her that he and Sarah are divorced. Seeing Sarah's photos in the room, the woman leaves Mark's house, causing Mark to fall asleep in that same room. On the other hand, Neil brings Sarah back to his home. Sarah keeps repeating that she's in a place filled with ashes and bodies, feeling alone, and insists her visions were accurate. Neil attempts to inject Sarah but struggles to find a vein. He tries calling his friend Helen, but she doesn't pick up. Sarah envisions herself surrounded by floating ashes, warning that the fades are growing stronger and will ultimately destroy the world. Before she passes away, she mentions Mark but couldn't finish her sentence. Returning to Paul, he also dreams of being in the same place as Sarah, surrounded by floating ashes. Awakening from this dream when he wets his bed, he changes his sheets and pants, insisting on washing them himself despite his mother offering to help. He then heads off to school. Meanwhile, when Mark awakens, Helen is in Sarah's bedroom, taking a pistol out of a drawer. They exchange a few words before Helen departs. Paul and Mac are on their college campus, with Mac loudly mentioning the bullet Paul found at the mall, though it doesn't attract single attention. Paul then confides in Mac about his recurring dreams coming true, like witnessing Neil fighting a non-human creature. He hopes Mac will believe him but struggles to find a way to make sense of these strange events. After their classes, they share light-hearted jokes as they make their way home. Along the route, Paul notices a strange girl standing in the road, but Mac doesn't see her. After she leaves, Paul brushes off the incident as a joke. On their way home, they stop at a grocery store and discuss snacks. Jay, Paul's crush, enters the store and buys cigarettes. Driven, Paul decides to try cigarettes too, and buys some. Back home, he hides them under his bed. Moments later, Helen visits Neil and tells him she took a gun from Sarah's place. Neil explains that he lost his guns while fighting the creature. They decide to bury Sarah, but Helen insists on examining Neil's injured eye first, which was hurt during the previous night's encounter. Helen helps Neil secure himself in a chair and carefully removes the poisonous substance from his eye. Neil grunts with pain as Helen attempts to heal his eye. When Helen tries to heal him by placing her hand over his eye, a powerful force surrounds them, but she is unable to restore Neil's vision. The force knocks Helen to the floor, and a moth emerges from her mouth, revealing that the creature infected Neil's cornea, leaving him permanently blind in that eye. While Paul is hiding cigarettes under his bed, Neil tracks down Paul's residence and hides behind Paul's room door. Afterward, he takes Paul to the top of a building where they observe people on rooftops of nearby houses. Neil explains to Paul about the fades, which are spirits of the dead stuck on Earth, unable to move on. These spirits cause organic matter to burn when passing through them. Paul then asks Neil about the creature that attacked him earlier. Neil reveals it's a new kind of entity. This prompts Paul to suggest Neil is like a ghostbuster. Neil agrees with Paul's assessment. Paul later visits his therapist, who explains that his recurring dreams and bedwetting are likely connected to his parents' divorce. Paul asks for medication, but the therapist refuses, advising him not to feel ashamed of being different. As Paul leaves the therapist's office, he bumps into the girl he had seen earlier on the road. The encounter sparks a burning sensation, leaving Paul curious. Subsequently, Mark, who teaches history at Paul's school, visits the station where Detective Chief Inspector Armstrong informs him that Sarah is presumed dead based on blood found at the scene, but informs that her body has not been located yet. At night, Paul and Mac go to the forest and observe Anna, Paul's sister, Jay, and their friends partying around a bonfire. While discussing a movie, Paul notices Sarah's spirit walking in the forest, emitting light from her chest. Intrigued, he follows her into the woods, with Neil quietly following Paul everywhere he goes. After a while, Neil explains to Paul that the deceased carry light, called beacons, with them when they are near ascension points, holes in the earth where the dead can pass from this world. When the light goes out, it means they are trapped in the earth forever. As Sarah moves forward, her light extinguishes before she can ascend. Simultaneously, Paul faints and experiences a vision of himself being stabbed. Bleeding and feeling close to death, he crawls through ashes. When he returns to reality, Neil asks what Paul sees, but he is unable to respond. Meanwhile, Helen is killed by the creature at Neil's residence, and the creature lets out a chilling howl from the rooftop. In the following scene, things become even more chaotic for Paul. His apocalyptic visions now include seeing the lifeless bodies of Jay, Anna, and his mother as he moves through the house. He wakes suddenly, having wet the bed again. Paul confides in Mac about these disturbing visions, but Mac's joking responses and playful thoughts question Paul's sanity. Mac even jests about Anna being half naked in Paul's bed in the vision, adding a lighter tone to their serious conversation. Meanwhile, Neil learns of Helen's death and arranges her body next to Sarah's. Sarah's spirit appears to Neil, lamenting that the world is ending and nothing can be done to save it. However, Neil remains steadfast in his belief that there is always a way. After placing the bodies together, he sets the house on fire. Later at school, Anna announces the need for volunteers for the school's ball party. Mac eagerly decides to join for fun, but Paul hesitates, knowing his sister wouldn't approve of them joining. He ignores Mac's attempts to persuade him. Just then, two younger students, Sam and Fred, try to tease Paul and Mac. Mark arrives behind them, scolding them for scratching one of the teacher's cars. Moments later, Neil appears at Paul's school and takes him to an old orphanage, Monica Bryant Country Care Home, in search of a specific fade. Inside, Neil suggests they split up to cover more ground, without revealing who they're looking for. As they separate, Paul encounters the girl he saw earlier in the middle of the road, and asks if she's the one Neil seeks. She leads Paul to a wall adorned with pictures of former students, where Paul discovers a photo of Neil as a boy from the orphanage. The girl then flees, with Paul in pursuit until they reach a spot where water has spilled on the ground. She attempts to electrocute Paul, but Neil arrives just in time to save him. Neil identifies the girl as Natalie. When Paul tries to explain that she tried to harm him by cutting a wire, Neil dismisses his concern. Neil guides Paul to meet Eric, a former angelic spirit who has been deceased since 1944, with a body that has been aging ever since. Neil explains that Eric is partially blind and mostly deaf, cautioning Paul to avoid sudden movements that might startle him. When Eric touches Paul, a radiant angelic light releases from him. Neil explains to Paul how Eric views him as special, overwhelming Paul and causing him to run out of the building. As Paul exits the building, a dead bird drops in front of him. Carefully, he moves the bird to a nearby dustbin. But to his surprise, the bird suddenly comes back to life. Before he could process what happened, Jay arrives and inquires if Paul plans to attend the ball. Paul appears uncertain and heads to his class, where he arrives late to Mark's lecture. While there, he encounters the spirit of Sarah. After class, Paul and Mac head to the cafeteria where Anna and her friends are deciding on the ball's theme. At first, Anna hesitates to let them volunteer, but Jay suggests they could help with janitorial tasks. Finally, Anna agrees to let them join in. At night, Sarah follows Mark home where they discover the girl Mark was with earlier. She expresses sympathy upon learning about Sarah's death. Mark and the girl then proceed to make out in Sarah's bedroom, accidentally knocking over images and files from her cupboard in the process. Meanwhile, as Paul walks down the street, Sam and Fred approach him again and start teasing him. As Paul continues, Natalie along with the creature and other fades attempt to capture him, but Neil arrives just in time to rescue him. They escape to Neil's car, which now serves as his home. There, Paul expresses his decision to stop supporting Neil, as he doesn't understand his role as one of the angelics. However, Neil reminds Paul of all the times he could have fled but instead chose to confront challenges. He emphasizes that Paul has a deep connection to things, and Eric believes Paul is the most special among the angelics. On the other hand, Sam and Fred are playing on the court when Sam tosses the ball out of bounds, prompting Fred to retrieve it. After some time passes with Fred gone, the ball unexpectedly returns from the opposite direction, now stained with blood. Shortly afterward, the creature also kills Sam from behind. The following morning, Mark discovers photographs of Sarah in a hospital, leading him to believe she has mental health issues and might be attempting suicide. He considers using these photos as evidence to support Sarah's case. Meanwhile, Paul and Neil ascend the mountain to locate the ascension points. Along the journey, Neil informs Paul that he must leave everyone behind, and accompany him underground. As they navigate through the dark woods, they encounter the creature feeding flesh to Natalie on the bodies of the two teenagers, Sam and Fred. Neil realizes that the Fades are gaining strength from consuming flesh, which enhances their ability to interact with their surroundings. That night, after coming back from Neil's place, Paul decides to visit Mac. He calls Mac to see if he can come over, and Mac agrees. At Mac's house, Paul and Mac are practicing dance moves for the ball. Suddenly, Mac's father, Detective Chief Inspector Armstrong, bursts into the room angrily and shoves Mac into a shelf, injuring his arm. Paul quickly grabs a tissue to help stop the bleeding, but when he removes it, the cut miraculously disappears. They also notice a strange glow on Paul's hand, and he suddenly feels nauseous, causing a moth to emerge from his mouth. At this point, Mac recognizes how special Paul is and urges his best friend not to leave him behind. The following day, Detective Chief Armstrong discovers the bodies of Sam and Fred deep in the forest where the creature had fed Natalie. This news disrupts Anna's plans to host the ball party, as the principal refuses to proceed with it. Meanwhile, Mac, who is eagerly anticipating the party, overhears their conversation and encourages them to come up with an alternative plan. Anna then decides to organize the ball party, with Jay's father renovating the old church and assigning Jay to oversee the arrangements. Afterward, Paul visits his therapist seeking guidance on how to bid farewell to his loved ones as he prepares to embark on a journey with Neil. However, he leaves the session without finding the answers he seeks. Back at home, he tests his supernatural abilities in solitude, only to realize they no longer function. His experiment is interrupted by his mother, whom he assures of his harmless intentions. Later, Mac picks up Paul for the ball. On the way, Neil appears, urging Paul to reconsider, but Paul negotiates more time to fulfill his life. Neil reluctantly lets him go but decides to keep an eye on him at the ball. At the ball, Paul nervously confesses his feelings to Jay, who reciprocates hers by kissing him. Their moment is interrupted when Anna comes looking for Jay, prompting her to push Paul away. Jay admits to her internal conflict between her popular image and her genuine feelings for Paul. Inspired, Paul decides to manage the two sides of his life. Meanwhile, Neil notices Natalie and trails her outside the ball. Outside, he is attacked by the creature and other Fades, leaving him wounded on the ground. Just as Neil is losing consciousness, Helen arrives and urges him to reveal information about the boy. In contrast, energized by recent events, Paul calls Neil and asserts his determination to balance being the Paul his loved ones know and the one fighting against evil forces. In the upcoming episode, Paul dreams about kissing Jay and suddenly wakes up in his bed. He realizes he's sprouted wings. Later that day, he goes to his therapist and expresses gratitude for helping him come to terms with his newfound abilities. Feeling more comfortable with his powers, he meets Jay and mentions a humorous side effect of his abilities, though she clearly doesn't believe him. On the other hand, Helen and Neil have a conversation in his car. Helen realizes Neil's injuries are more serious than she thought, and he urgently needs medical help. Despite this, Neil remains focused on Paul's significance in their situation. Helen informs Neil that she will soon be ascending, and urges him to contact the other angelics. Meanwhile, Mac is at home with his father, who seems too busy to wish Mac a happy birthday, which disappoints him. During this time, his father is pressured by his boss to find a suspect in the murders. As he heads to work, Mark appears before him, showing him a photo of Sarah and Neil. Mark believes Neil is responsible for Sarah's death. Later on, Neil and Helen return to the orphanage with Natalie trailing behind them. Neil encounters Sarah, who asks him to help her communicate with Mark, but Neil refuses, upsetting Sarah. Helen supports Neil's choice, though the conflict is evident on her troubled, angelic face. Meanwhile, Jay and Paul go on a date, discussing everyday matters. Believing they are alone, they begin kissing, only to be caught by Anna and her boyfriend. When Anna criticizes their relationship, Paul, frustrated, inadvertently glues her lips by unknown means. Everyone, including Paul himself, is stunned by his actions. Later at home, Paul tries to apologize to his sister for the incident, but she is upset and pissed with him. Paul finds himself drawn into a family debate involving his mother. Trying to escape the tension, he rushes out the house. Suddenly, he has a waking vision that almost triggers a seizure. He sees a place covered in ashes, where a shadowy figure approaches him amid chaos. Before he can identify the man, Paul snaps out of the situation. Paul, feeling overwhelmed by both his supernatural and everyday life, seeks help from his best friend, Mac. However, still upset about not receiving birthday wishes, Mac ignores him, which Paul doesn't understand. Lost in his thoughts, Paul walks through the city with the ghostly Natalie following him. When he sees her, he expresses his frustration, telling her that if she wants to hurt him, she can do so because he's already having a bad day. Anna talks with her mom about Paul, triggering unexpected insecurities in herself. When Paul gets home, he goes straight to his room, still upset. His mom asks about celebrating, reminding him he forgot Mac's birthday. Feeling guilty, he surprises Mac the next day with a happy birth yesterday message in his yard, apologizing for his struggles balancing his dual lives. Paul has another vision while at Mac's place, causing him to have a seizure. In this vision, he sees the face of a mysterious man who approaches him and cryptically says that things are inevitable. When Paul wakes up, he feels an urgent need for answers and goes to the orphanage to find Neil. When he reaches inside, Helen is informing the group about the dangers they can face now that the Fades have gained physical abilities. Neil is severely injured and struggles to stand. Moments later, Neil collapses, and everyone rushes to his side. Paul decides to help and places his hands over Neil's wounds, miraculously healing all his injuries, including his eye. Helen and the others are amazed, with Helen admitting that Paul can do things even she couldn't. Paul discusses his apocalyptic dreams and the appearance of a new mysterious figure with Neil. Neil suggests that Paul move in with him and the other angelics for safety, but Paul refuses. Neil is concerned that Paul doesn't grasp the seriousness of their situation and the danger they can face. Meanwhile, Helen strategizes with the other angelics, emphasizing the need to capture a weaker Fade to understand their capabilities. One of the angelics mentions that there was an agreement between the Fades and angelics that got broken, but Helen dismisses any chance of making peace, saying the Fades betrayed them. Later that night, Neil goes to Mark's house as Sarah asks him to. Acting as a mediator, Neil helps Sarah communicate with Mark, revealing his ability to interact with spirits. In their talk, Mark starts thinking Neil was cheating with Sarah. Sarah then intervenes and tells that Mark kissed another girl, Vicky, recently. Neil explains to Mark that they are angelics, and tells him about their special powers and existence. Paul seeks Mac's assistance to mend things with Jay, using Mac's advice on expressing love effectively. With Mac's help, Paul succeeds in patching things up with Jay, leading to a kiss in her room. However, Paul notices Natalie's ghost observing them from outside. He leaves Jay and pursues Natalie. Natalie is then captured by the other two angelic, who then bring her to the orphanage. Meanwhile, Helen and Neil discuss Neil's recent actions and his future responsibilities. Neil feels reassured after assisting Sarah, while Helen prepares him for his upcoming role as a leader. She suggests Neil must overcome his own uncertainties and discover the strength within himself to lead effectively. One of the angelics informs the group about Natalie being captured. They are surprised to hear her scream since Fades typically cannot scream. They wonder what else the Fades have gained. Neil orders Natalie to be tied up and urges them to show no mercy in finding the other creature. Meanwhile, Paul and Jay are making out when Paul nervously warns Jay not to be alarmed if he suddenly sprouts wings. At the same time, Mark talks with Sarah, still in disbelief that she's so close yet invisible and inaudible to him. His shock deepens when Detective Armstrong, feeling pressure to find a culprit, suspects Mark of murder due to his connection with all four victims. Sitting on a bench outside the ice cream shop, Paul and Mac discuss Paul's transition into adulthood. Paul gives Mac a key to his house as his birthday present, symbolizing their close bond. They joke around as usual, but Paul negligently wanders into the street and is struck by a truck. Meanwhile, Helen begins her ascension with Neil by her side, tearfully watching her shine brightly before disappearing. Neil expresses his struggle to accept her departure. The creature also undergoes a transformation, shedding its monstrous appearance as its skin peels away, revealing a human form. It then emerges from the dark tunnel with a terrifying growl. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on the notification, and leave 1,000 likes or 100 comments if you'd like us to continue part 2. Thank you.